When you hear the word Bedlam, you probably think of chaos, screaming, and disorder. But that word, it actually came from a very real place. A place so infamous, so cruel, so bizarre that its reputation has haunted history for centuries. Bethlehem Royal Hospital in London. Let's rewind a little bit. Bethlem started in 1247, not as a hospital at all, but as a priory, a religious house run by the Order of the Star of Bethlehem. At first its mission was charity, but by the late 1300s, records started calling it something unusual, a place for lunatics. That made it one of the first dedicated asylums in Europe. Now that sounds progressive, until you look closer. From the very beginning, conditions were grim. The building itself was crumbling, dark, and overcrowded. Patients were chained to walls, crammed into tiny cells, and left to scream or weep in the dark. Keepers walked the halls with whips, and treatment was often just brutal restraint. And here's the thing, not everyone inside was mentally ill. Sometimes families dumped unwanted relatives, political troublemakers, or people with epilepsy, dementia, or simply eccentric personalities. Bedlam became a dumping ground. By the 1600s, Bedlam had a reputation, and Londoners, they were curious. They wanted to see the madmen, so the hospital started allowing visitors. For the price of a penny, you could stroll the wards and watch the patients. It became one of London's most popular attractions, drawing as many as 96,000 visitors a year. Imagine it, families with children, wealthy nobles, even foreign tourists, all walking through Bedlam as if it were a zoo. They laughed at patients raving, mocked their delusions, and sometimes even poked them with sticks. One French visitor in 1676 described it like this: "There is a house in London where they lock up lunatics and chain them to the walls. People go to see them as they would wild beasts." Patients became a sideshow. Some were dressed up in costumes for visitors. Others were encouraged to sing, dance, or shout for amusement. One of the most famous patients was James Tilly Matthews, admitted in 1797. Matthews believed he was the target of a sinister contraption called the heirloom, a machine hidden under London that supposedly blasted him with magnetic rays, controlling his thoughts and actions. Instead of treatment, Bedlam turned him into a spectacle. His drawings of the heirloom, full of gears and rays, survive today in the Wellcome collection. Now, let's talk about treatments, if you can call them that. Patients might be subjected to bloodletting, where doctors drained them in hopes of balancing humors. Others were dunked in cold baths until they were shivering uncontrollably. Restraint chairs kept them immobilized for hours. Some were spun in giant rotating devices, literally strapped to a chair and whirled around until they vomited, under the theory that this might reset their minds. And then there were the infamous Utica cribs, coffin-like boxes with slats, where patients could be locked down like animals. The contrast between rich and poor patients were striking. Wealthy families could pay for private rooms, clean clothes, and even gardens. But poorer patients lived in squalor, chained, dirty, and often starving. Bedlam's reputation spread far beyond London. Writers and poets used it as a symbol of madness. Alexander Pope referenced it in his satires. Jonathan Swift, author of Gulliver's Travels, mocked its cruelty. Even William Hogarth's famous painting series, A Rake's Progress, ends with the main character in Bedlam, surrounded by mocking visitors. And then came the move. In 1676, Bedlam was relocated to a grand building in Moorfields, designed to look like a palace. From the outside, it seemed impressive, but inside, the abuse continued. Historian Roy Porter once said that Bedlam was a palace of despair. Scandals piled up. Keepers were accused of beating patients, stealing food, and pocketing bribes. Doctors were often little more than caretakers with no real medical knowledge. By the 18th and 19th centuries, reformers began to expose the horrors. One of the most famous was Charles Dickens, who described Bedlam in his works as a place of misery and cruelty. Slowly, public outrage pushed for change. Chains were gradually removed. The practice of parading patients as entertainment was abolished in the 18th century. Treatments began shifting. Though they were still crude by the modern standards, focusing more on rest, work, and structured routines rather than outright torture. How nice of them. By the Victorian era, Bethlem tried to reinvent itself as a modern psychiatric hospital, but the legacy of its past was impossible to shake. Today, Bethlem still exists. It's in Bethlehem, London, operating as part of the NHS, and it even has a museum, the Bethlem Museum of the Mind. You can walk through exhibits of patient artwork, including pieces by Richard Dadd, a Victorian painter who murdered his father while in a psychotic episode and spent decades in Bethlehem. It's eerie to think a place once infamous for chains, bloodletting, and public humiliation is now celebrated for the very art and humanity of the people it once dehumanized. So the next time you hear someone describe chaos as Bedlam, just remember, that word isn't just colorful slang. It comes from real people, locked away, laughed at, and forgotten in the most infamous asylum of all time. So what do you think? It was horrible. Let me know your thoughts in the comments.